Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and with me today is Tyler Rablin. He is a former instructional technology coach who decided to return to the high school ELA classroom and is currently also an education consultant. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Literature from my alma mater, Western Washington University, and a Master's of Arts in Teaching from Lewis and Clark College in Portland. He is national board certified in early adolescent, young adult English language arts. He enjoys reading, running, and spending time hiking and camping with his wife and two dogs. Welcome, Tyler. Thank you so much for coming on to my show.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So can you share a little bit about your current building and kind of like the demographics and what your school kind of looks and feels like?
Yeah, so I currently teach out in Central Washington, in kind of a rural setting. We're an ag area,
Mhm.
agriculture. So our school, we're for being in the middle of nowhere, we're a surprisingly big high school. We have about 2,100 kids right
Okay.
now. Our makeup, we have a lot of migrant students. Our EL population is pretty high.
Mhm.
We're about 90% free and reduced lunch, and
Wow.
about our kind of demographic breakdown, we're about 90% Hispanic and 10%, it's about 3% native and about, what's the math, 7% white, I think is how it
Right.
breaks. So for being in a small area, we're a surprisingly big school, a traditional public school, nothing out of the ordinary, I guess, with it, just sort of your classic public high school.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that your population of Native Americans is small. I know that there are some dedicated schools in Washington, but there's also a lot of students who go to their local public high schools in throughout the state. So it kind of, I don't know, it surprises me that there's not a larger population.
Yeah, there's a couple smaller high schools closer to like Toppenish High School and stuff that will pull a bigger population of our native students.
Hmm, interesting. How have you grown as an educator?
Man, a lot. I feel like I've been in the classroom for 10 years now, and the first 8, I mean, like your first 2 years of teaching, there's just a ridiculous amount of growth because you have
Right.
to. It's sink or swim. And then, I feel like year 3 to year, I guess 7 for me was like, okay, I'm getting it figured out. And then COVID happened.
Mhm.
And these last 3 years, I mean, I think my practice grew the most in my first 5 years, probably. And since then, it's been a lot of refining. But I
Mhm.
think probably one of the biggest struggles as an educator right now is sort of grappling with the shifts that we're experiencing, like from COVID and remote schooling and all the stuff that happened around that. Um, I mean, I'm pretty transparent when I share things, especially like on Twitter. It's
Mhm.
been emotionally, it's required a lot of growth. Like it has been very difficult to let go of what we were used to, of what we were accustomed to expect, of what school is like. And so I mean, I feel like I've grown a ton just in terms of emotionally understanding my role in my profession, what I can do, what I can't do. Like I have to accept that I have limitations and be okay with that. That's been
Absolutely.
probably the most of my growth right now.
So can you give me an example? Because like I feel like I understand what you're saying, but I just kind of want to make sure that I have a crystal clear idea.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I think any teacher
Mhm.
will feel this right now, but like phones in the classroom. My
Yes.
approach for the longest time was students, like they stay with students hold on to them, they just monitor them. Like I have to give a few corrections. And when we had students at home for 1.5, 2 years with their phone, like they developed very different habits and then came back to school with those habits. And what I was used to, like I do not, it's just extra work for me if I have to really like be in charge of phones and like really have like strict policies and procedures and stuff. And that was not me. And it was frustrating to me at first to be like, that's, like this is how I teach, this is how I teach. And it just wasn't meshing with the changes that I was seeing in students and just in society as a whole. And so I was very, very frustrated with it for a while and did a lot of like blaming students, and I don't like to admit it, but like that was sort of my frustration. I was like, students aren't engaging in work, all they want to do is be on their phones. And eventually I had to hit a spot of realizing like it's my responsibility to help these kids be successful. In the past, that has allowed me to just say, keep your phones, just be mindful of it. But I've had to recognize like these are habits that have developed, and habits are not easily broken without support. And so like this year, I've been more intentional about like I actually collect phones at the beginning of class. Each student has a spot with a number, and they check it in, and students have been really good. We have, I mean, I like to make sure that there's a lot of conversations that happen around it, not just here's the rule, do it, but like, here's what happens with your brain with social media. Here's what social media companies are trying to do. Like, like just a lot of stuff for me to say, it's hard to get across, but to be able to say like, I care about you. And that's why I'm doing it.
And your
And I mean,
development.
yeah, and this is good for you. Like, this is frustrating, but like, this is why this is happening. And I got to a spot from just being frustrated and blaming kids to having more procedures built in and routines built into my room, and now we're all working just better together. And that was a tough growing pain, and I'm still trying to figure out how do I now release that back a little bit. Like, I don't want to say the only way that we can control your phone is if it's out of your possession. Like, that's not going to help them in the long term, but I'm still figuring that part out.
Well, but here's the thing, like, from the administrator hat, I've had so many teachers go like, we just need a building wide, rule about it. And so that way they don't have to do that work. So I'm really curious as to how you understood yourself enough to recognize, hey, I'm blaming my students. I'm not necessarily taking the responsibility and the control of the environment that I can, and supporting them and understanding how to meet that expectation in a way that allows them some agency in that process.
Yeah, I part of what made me realize it, like this summer, I had to do a bunch of writing, and I mean, there was a time like I took off to the woods for a week, so I would have no cell service and no distractions, and that was the only way that I got a good chunk of writing done. And so I, going back to school, being like, oh, why can't they focus with their phones? And then I realized like I had to avoid my phone for a week to be able to focus. Like, and so I just had to realize that like, okay, let me reflect on what I do when I know that I need to focus, and the habits that I've built and the practices I've built into my own relationship with technology and social media. And that's what really kind of woke me up to say, like, if this is what makes me productive and happy and helps me, like grow and learn, I want to help kids develop these skills and these habits. So that's, I mean, we've had a building wide push just to say like, we know phones are a huge distraction right now.
Right.
There hasn't been like a hard and fast rule about phones. So that was sort of up to the teacher to decide what it looked like in their classroom, but it was very much like an intentional move as a school to say, we know the research around how social media and phones affect mental health, affect like
Absolutely.
teens' emotions. And so like there's some responsibility that to do something about it.
Right. And well, like what I was trying to emphasize is, when you have, say, 100 teachers, particularly, at least I found that the foreign language teachers use the phone differently in their classrooms. So just having one blanket rule for a building doesn't work, but many teachers will push for that because in their classrooms it will work, and they don't necessarily have to do the growth that you're describing because they don't, like, they just want someone to do it for them and say, like, this is the kibosh, and not have to do that work. So I do have another segue question that is somewhat related. How do you think, with that year or two at home, how do you think that shifted the power dynamics with students not necessarily feeling the need to be mediated for like how they access information or what they understand, and also being able to have more access to celebrities and other, like, if you can tweet at someone or you can Snapchat a famous person, what power and authority do you as a classroom teacher have, and how has that shifted?
I think it's shifted quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
The big thing that I think about is how do I want to word this? So I almost use it as like with students and teachers and school as sort of like that. There was a shared understanding
Mm-hmm.
of this is how things function and operate. Not necessarily that that was a good thing. There were definitely plenty of issues with how that dynamic worked.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, students spent 2 years, depending on where you're at, a year and a half, 2 years
Like
away
six
from some
months.
of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. My wife's an elementary teacher, so not very long for her. But at the
Right.
secondary level, we were out of the building for quite a bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think what students realized in that time is uh, a lot of students saw some of the issues with how they have to act in schools.
Mm.
um, and they didn't have to experience it when they were at home. Like the classic example is just like using the restroom, right? Like in schools, because we'd have such a large amount of kids usually in a building, there ends up being this sense that like we can't just have kids going all the time anywhere. It becomes
Right.
chaotic, it becomes, you know.
Disruptive.
And yeah, and so then you have kids who for a year and a half are like, I have to go to the bathroom, I can go to the bathroom now, you know. And then they come back to school and they're like, I have to go to the bathroom, I only have 3 passes, like I have to have this book, I can't go to the bathroom, like. And so, and it's, you know, they're just, I feel like when we came back together, we didn't take enough time to name that here are things that we do in schools that are weird, right? Like
Right.
weird, or that are in certain times like oppressive or controlling. And we didn't take enough time to really reflect on what are those things,
Mm-hmm.
and do we need them? Because in some sense, like, yes, we can't just have 20 kids out of each classroom going to the bathroom. That would just, it doesn't work when you have 2,000 bodies in an area together.
Right.
um and so like recognizing like, yes, this is a thing that coming back is going to be weird, but also being able to have a conversation with kids about like, hey, I know this is weird, I know you had got to do it a different way for a really long time, here's why we have to do some things certain ways, but also being willing to say there are some things that we've done forever in schools that after a year and a half of you having a different experience, we should start to rethink. um so
So that
yeah.
begs the question, what's your school's bathroom policy then?
We have students have handbooks now, and they have to take the handbook with them. It's supposed to be one kid out of the room at a time. Yeah, the handbook thing. It's I don't. I just like kids hand it to me to sign, and half the time I'm like, "Can you just forge my signature?" Because that thing's been in the bathroom so many times, I don't want to touch it. Like, but
Ew, that's gross.
yep.
They're thinking some of them, maybe not all of them, but some of them are like, I wish I could burn this thing. Interesting.
That
Interesting.
should be this. It's a new policy this year. I feel like that needs to be the end of the year. We need a bonfire at the end of the year. Although everyone, I feel like you have to throw it in and then run away because who knows what we're releasing if we burn those pages.
Oh, we didn't realize it was going to be combustible. Awesome. That is hilarious. So in this kind of environment where I think we're at a moment of transition in particularly in secondary schools, because the models that we've been using are, we know they're woefully outdated, but with COVID and with what students were able to do kind of in their own homes, it was a somewhat of a game changer. So what do you think it takes to be an effective educator right now?
Probably one of the trickiest parts right now
Mm-hmm.
is, and this is showing quite a bit of my bias because my background and expertise is around assessment and grading, but um, is learning how to look for evidence of learning as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to how to create one path to show that learning. Coming back, I mean, students, for the a lot of students, some students did great with remote learning when they were online, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot of students just didn't for a number of reasons, right? Like they didn't have access to internet at home, they didn't have, like, parents had to work, they were home alone, like nobody's
They had to work.
Yeah, they had to work. And so a lot of students just kind of developed a habit of like, I get an assignment, maybe I'll do it. Maybe not. We'll see. Um, and coming back to school, I know that's been a big frustration for a lot of teachers. I heard one person call it like, uh, how do they phrase it? Like, I'm not the most concerning pandemic to me right now is the pandemic of missing assignments. Like, it's just
Mm,
their students were just not engaging in the work that we were expecting them to do. And so I think
mm,
one of the biggest things that is going to be required of us is finding that balance of while still helping students develop some of that productive behavior that they'll need when they go, well, now, if whatever they're doing, like they'll need some of those productive behaviors, but also still having that flexibility to say, not I'm giving you a quiz, but to
mhm.
say, I'm looking for evidence that you know, I'm an English teacher, that's my background, like evidence that
Right.
you know how to analyze characters in a text.
Mhm.
How can I do that? Like if I sit down with a student and listen to them talk about a text that we read and they're doing it, that's evidence of learning. If I'm, you know, I've done it a few times where students are working in groups and I just listen in and I can hear one student like teaching their group mates about the text and what's going on, and I'm like, yeah, maybe that kid forgot to do their quiz the week before, and we'll talk about that and like, you know, how that could be an issue if it becomes a habit, but I still have evidence of learning from that student and I can still use that to say, look, you're growing, look, you're getting better. So I think right now that that's one of the trickiest but one of the most important things that for all of us to continue to focus on.
So I think when I hear what you said, I'm thinking the really what you're talking about is flexibility in demonstrating how you know or what
Yes,
you know.
absolutely. And from the teacher side of valuing that too,
Mhm,
um, of being able to recognize that there are different ways students can show us what they know, and just because
mhm.
it's different from what I expected doesn't mean it's less valuable than what I was planning on.
Right. And or it's less impactful for the student down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if, you know, like at secondary schools, like my wife teaches elementary, and I feel like all of us high school teachers could learn so much from sitting in elementary classrooms. Like elementary classrooms are just, they're phenomenal. They're amazing. Um,
They're always
and like,
juggling something.
oh, exactly. Yeah, I don't understand how they do it. Like I sit in there. Sometimes my school day ends about an hour earlier than my wife, and
Uh-huh.
every so often I get to go over and like hang out in a room and like see what's going on. And I spend an hour in there, and I'm like, I don't know how you do it. Like it's so tiring. Like there's so much going on, and she's just like a pro at it. But in there, I watch so often like their kids will be reading a book, and
Mhm.
she'll be like, "Hey, here's a few different ways. Like show me what you know, show me how you do this." In high school, you know, we don't always do that as much. It's but if you know if you've got a student who loves, I don't know, I have a few students this year that are super into music, and if
Okay.
I can let them like lean into that passion, like creating music, not just every kid's into listening to music right now, but they're into creating music.
Thank you for the clarification there.
And if I can let them lean into that passion, then, you know, maybe if it's a quiz, they don't feel confident about their ability to take a quiz, they take the quiz, it doesn't go well, they feel worse about their ability to do that, and now their struggle with taking a quiz is now equated with their struggle with learning, versus if they can lean into a strength or a passion and that confidence leads into confidence in the classroom, like that's huge. And I think that's the part of choice and like sort of that student voice piece that we so
Mhm.
often forget about. It's like it's engaging, it gets them to do the work. And I'm like, okay, but that's not really the point. The point is they learn and they feel confident about that learning. And that's really what the point is to me.
Right. I completely agree. I was going to go off on some other tangent, but I completely forgot my thought. So since we're talking around it, the assessment piece, your upcoming book is Hacking Motivation Through Assessment. Can you tell us your why for writing this book and what you hope educators will learn or take from it?
Yeah, my why behind writing the book was I went on a pretty long journey with my assessment practices where, you know, first couple years teaching, I did what I'd always experienced as a student where, you know, it was a very traditional approach. My grade book was a collection of tasks that we did and how well I did on the tasks.
Mhm.
And very early on, like it was about my second year of teaching, I started to get exposed to standards-based grading.
Mhm.
And I was intrigued by that because, you know, to me, that opens up a lot of those doors that we've been talking about with student choice and student voice. Because instead of saying you have to take this quiz with standards-based grading, you can say, hey, I'm looking for this specific skill. There are now a number of ways that students can show me that. And so I
Mhm.
got there, and that road sort of led me towards trying to be more accurate with my record keeping, more accurate with, you know, tracking student learning, which is a valuable skill. But what I ended up doing is I almost ended up overdoing it with that, where I was trying to collect so much data and make everything about information and numbers, and it sort of killed the love of learning for me and for students. It was just like we were data machines in this box, and the whole point was to get all the data together. And so the book is it, instead of just like hacking assessment, it's really focused on like the point of assessing students is to build their motivation and confidence. It's to say, hey, you showed me that you know this, you're growing here, here's your
Mhm.
next step. And so that's kind of my why behind the book. Is it took me like it was a 10-year journey for me to get to a spot of like, oh my gosh, this stuff was important, but it is not the reason it's important. And so the
Mhm.
book is really, here's the reason why kind of assessment reform and rethinking our assessment practices in our classroom is so crucial for, you know, for us as teachers. I do feel like that process of learning standards-based grading and pursuing that really helped me understand my teaching, understand my assessment practices. But getting to the heart of why we do it is where it ends up being valuable in the classroom and in the learning and with those kids specifically.
As a high school person, you have how many students do you have on a like in what's your schedule? What's your schedule? Are you blocked or are you not blocked?
We have we're sort of in the middle. We have about a
Okay.
65-minute class period.
Okay.
So I have I have 4 class periods of students every day, and then I've got my planning period. So I've got about, we run about 30, 31 in each class is about what I
Mhm.
sit at. So about 120 kids is pretty average.
So is what you're talking about in being able to give student choice and voice in how they demonstrate their learning, is that, do you find that, because I've had some students of mine, I'm an adjunct professor right now, so I've had some students of mine who have upwards of 160 students, for example, every day. It blows my mind.
Yeah.
Um, right, but like the scalability of those things becomes an issue as well. So how do you address that um, complication that exists in the secondary classroom that doesn't necessarily exist in your wife's classroom?
That was, man, when I first started, like with giving students choice, I just remember being like, I don't even know where to find their evidence of learning anymore. Like it's spread, it's
Mhm.
all over the place. They went to this site and made a video. They went here and made like a cartoon. And I'm like, I don't know where it is. And what I've started doing is I now use, I call it a choice memo. So if they
Mhm.
go create different products, they come back together. And there's really 2 parts of it. One is, you know, what did you create? Explain it. And then if you can link it or staple it to the paper, whatever it is. So what did you
Mhm.
make? And then down below, I always have a spot to say, what skill were you working on? What did you learn about that skill? And how did you show it in your project? The nice
Nice.
thing with that, while I love getting to go see their project still and see what they made, almost all of the information I need to
Right
evaluate their
there.
learning is
Right.
right on that one page. And it added an extra step of sort of that metacognition, that reflection of the student
Mhm.
saying, what did I learn? Did I just, you know, go out and
Right.
make a cool project and I had no idea what I was supposed to be focusing on? Or did I actually focus on the learning I was supposed to do? And so it's like a pause, like, hey, maybe make sure that you're learning. Like, yes, it's fun. Yes, you're excited. Did we learn to? Like, that's got to be in there a little bit.
So with the student population you have, which is largely Latino, do you find that this opens up doors for them and they're learning that you might not have been able to access any other way?
Yeah, especially a lot of times when I approach choice, like I give options of here are things to do, and then there's almost always like an other box.
Mhm,
And some of my favorite projects that I've seen come out of that other box where,
mhm,
someone's looking at it and they're like, I don't really like these. Or sometimes, like if we're studying a text, I'll have students say, hey, I have this book that I'm reading that I love right now. Or right now, I have a bunch of students, we are analyzing like symbolism, and a bunch of my students are really into anime. And
yeah.
so, yeah, as is
As
so
an
many
ELA
people.
person, I was like, you can't get through a conversation without talking about anime.
Yeah. And so every so often, like I'll have a student be like, hey, can I talk about the symbolism in my anime right now? And I was like, sure, why not? Like that's the skill we're focusing on. You bring that in. Um, and even the cool part for me, so like with a pretty high EL population, we've got a number of students who like they are far more comfortable in Spanish than they are in English.
Mhm,
And there are certain times where like learning to write, yes, at some point we have to transition to being able to like practice that in English.
mhm.
But kind of that letting the student show me evidence of their learning in ways that are comfortable for them first to like really start building that confidence. I think that's one of the hardest things to figure out when you have EL students in your classroom is they are in an environment where they are not confident currently. And the confidence in the learning process is such an important piece. And so even just being able to say, like my Spanish is terrible. I've now gotten to the point where during student teacher conferences, when a student starts translating and I can tell they're not saying the thing that I said, I can start to catch that. That's about the extent of my Spanish right now.
You're like, no, no, no,
Yeah. I'm like, no, no, I said you're missing assignments, not they're all
no.
turned in. I don't know what got lost here. Um, so,
Look
but
at you
even
like, dang it.
I didn't even know I could do it. And then one day during conferences, I was like, oh no, that's not, I caught what you said. I am learning. Okay. Um, but like even with my Spanish not being good, I have friends that if a student needs to submit something in Spanish because they feel confident in that and they know they can show their learning that way, I'll figure it out. Like I can have someone come in and we can talk, they can translate the whole thing. I can use Google Translate, although who knows, hopefully that's close enough. You never know there. It's getting better. But
Every day, AI is advancing.
yep, absolutely. But that just gives students an opportunity. Like I have, the more I've gone down sort of this assessment, I
Mhm.
would like to call it a journey, but sometimes it's just a rabbit hole and I find all the different things to study. But I've seen so much how important that confidence piece is. And if we can find ways for students to take something they're confident in and start there and then approach something that they don't feel confident about, that makes such a big difference in that whole assessment process and the learning process for that kid.
Using their strengths to shore up those places where they're not as strong. Absolutely,
Yeah.
I completely agree. So, um, with your students, how do you? I mean, gosh, I wish we could just do this forever because I have like a billion questions that I think it would be super helpful for other teachers to know because what you're describing is what I think we all want to move towards, but some of us in our own like we're just not comfortable with making those moves because they're not what we experience and so they don't feel like they count, and B, so many teachers I talk to feel beholden to the curriculum or what the school district has handed to them, and they feel like they can't really step out of that with some of the concerns about teacher, I guess, quality. How do you wrestle with that, and do you address those issues in the book?
Yeah. I'm trying to think if it's in the book. I handed it off to the editors a while ago and I am trying to
That's okay.
remember what's in there. Um, so I will say if it's not in the book, my personal experience with that um, is I've been fortunate. I've worked for some really good administrators. I know there
Mhm.
are, other stories that aren't my own, but I've been super fortunate. So like one of the things that was really helpful to me in my second year of teaching, I had a student who she had like a single digit percent, and I know this story is actually in the book, but she had like single digit percent, and yet she was probably one of the most prolific readers and writers I have had to
Mm,
this date as a teacher. She just
mhm,
wasn't doing the reading and writing that was in the curriculum.
right.
And I sat down with my principal towards the end of that first semester, and I was sort of just like, you have these moments as teachers where like this is a pivotal moment for me, where I'm
Mhm,
watching a student who is absolutely brilliant, who thinks she's not, right? Who
right.
thinks I'm a terrible, I have an F in this class, like I am a terrible reader, I'm a terrible writer. And I sat down with my principal and I said, what can I do? And he just very transparently was like, has she shown you that she knows what she needs to do? Like maybe she didn't do the things, but has she shown you that? um and so I was able to say like absolutely, right, like probably to a higher degree than maybe anybody else in the class at this point. So yes, she has absolutely shown that she knows how to do the skills.
Mhm,
And after that, then I had a conversation with that same principal at the start of the next semester. I'd gotten a new class that was sort of a it was sort of like a, for lack of a better, an intervention class. Students that hadn't passed their state tests, they were supposed to be in there for test prep. I started being a second year teacher. I was like, what's a test prep class? Well, it's packets. Let's do those. And it was awful for everyone. Me, the students, nobody liked it. And I sat down with that same principal and I said, what do I need to do? Like, what are the requirements for this class? And he said, they need to get better at reading. They need to get better at writing.
oh,
And what I found over the course of my career, for the rest of the administrators I've worked for, most often the limitations I put on what I can do are my own limitations.
yes, I was
Um,
just thinking that.
because, and teachers, we are notoriously bad at this. Like we hold ourselves to such a high standard that oftentimes like nobody else is holding us to. And that's what's really like controlling us. And so like every time I've sat down with one of my administrators and said, I am struggling, like I right now my team, there's it fluctuates year to year. We were 9 people last year. I think we're like 8 people this year that teach freshman English. And we're
Mhm,
supposed to be within 5 days of each other. Like that's kind of the guideline we get. We're supposed to be within 5 days of each other of the curriculum. Every time I've sat down with an administrator to talk about that and say that I'm struggling with it, like my kids need more time in this area, every time it's do what's best for kids. Right. And so this fear that I have of I'm always going to get in trouble, I'm always going to get in trouble. I know I've been fortunate to work for administrators that put kids first, but it never hurts to ask, right? Like just to say, hey, kids are struggling because I'm trying to follow this policy. Everybody gets into education. Well, I say everybody. Let's hope everybody gets into education because they care about kids. And when that's the logic approaching a problem that you're trying to solve, like this isn't working for kids, I have to try something differently. You're very rarely met with the type of resistance, at least that we expect we're going to be met with.
so that another one of my little personal pet peeves is this notion that teachers, it feels to me, again, from the administrator side of it, things, that teachers often give away their power, like, oh, well, I can't do this or I can't do that. Like, I can't talk to that kid in the hallway because I don't know that kid. Sure, you can. you know well, I can't do, fill in the blank. So how have you reconciled, particularly in your situation, since your student body doesn't necessarily look and talk like you, so that you're always doing that building that bridge of making that relationship and getting to know. And when you have 2,100 students, obviously you're not going to know every single student, and you're not going to definitely not know every single student well. How do you maintain your own sense of agency as you're also navigating these very different waters from maybe your own educational experiences, or even what you were taught at Western? I don't know, because you and I are different generations, so but how has that developed for you?
What I've really had to get down to is, because there were so many things that was taught about this is how you should do things. This is how how you
Mhm.
make relationships. This is, and I think I did what so many new teachers do at the beginning of their career of like, this is what I know it's supposed to be. This is what I think I'm supposed to do. And
Right.
what I've really had to like understand is that I have to be careful. I want to make sure I'm, saying this correctly, but the only thing that really matters in terms of what I'm supposed to do is what the kids need.
Mm.
Um, and like that is my job. My job is to give them what they need so that they can learn and grow and be successful. And I think when I stripped all the way back to that, like the kids kind of are the power, for lack of a better term. Like they are the agency that I should lean on when I'm like, should I do this? I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. If my like North Star is my kids need this, right? Like, or this is what my kids are asking for, this is what they've expressed to me, then that's my job, that's my role, and I have the agency to do that. There have been times where I've stepped on toes a little bit and like stepped out of line slightly. If it happens, there's usually a conversation, but when that conversation is, I'm really sorry, but that's what my kids needed.
Mhm.
Like that's just the truth, and that's my job. And I really think that's where, as a teacher, our agency comes from. Of we know our kids, aside from their caregivers at home, aside from their best friends, we know our kids better than the administrators who pop into our rooms. Like, and good administrators that like I've been lucky to work for, they know that, right? And they know that like they're a level removed from kind of that student need.
Right.
And they're able to name that and understand that. And I think when a building gets behind the fact that agency is centered around kids' needs and what they need in that moment, that's where powerful things can get done, and important things can get done for kids.
Mm. So how do you manage the struggle between covering content and providing kids what they need?
So my goal with that is, um, I look at it from what is the student supposed to learn.
Mhm.
Because as an English teacher, man, we have like, there's like 40 math teachers will probably laugh at this. There's like 42 standards or whatever that we're supposed to cover. And I think it was Marzano that estimates it takes 5 hours of instruction just to cover a standard. Like that's not the student to learn a standard. And I'm like, not, it's like 210 hours. Is that what it is? If it's 42 standards, whatever it is, let's
Right.
just hope that's right for any math teachers listening. But like, I don't have 210 hours. I can't cover what I'm being told I'm supposed to cover in a year. And
Right.
like, I think that's the best place to start of like, this is an unrealistic expectation. What is the actual expectation? That kids are supposed to learn these 8-10 things in the trimester? Cool. We can do that. Like we can learn these 8 to 10 things. We might not read every text that's in the textbook. We might not do every single lesson that's in the curriculum guide. But if I can show that these kids are going to learn these 10 things, again, almost like the same way that it opens up options for students to focus on the standards that we're learning, the skills we're learning, they get to show it in different ways. For me as a teacher, like that's kind of my license to say, students need to learn these skills. I'm going to make sure
Mhm.
they learn it. Like for anybody checking, I'm going to make sure that we're learning these things, but we might do it a little differently.
Right. What I hear you saying is you're really putting the humanity back into the practice. And so I feel like particularly in the 80s and 90s, and as we went into No Child Left Behind and that kind of accountability system, we tried to anesthetize the process of teaching and learning and make it this thing that's devoid of human interaction, but it's profoundly a human interaction. And so it doesn't work that way. Your students are not products, they're people. And so what I hear you saying is at the beginning and the end of the day, you're asking, how am I serving the people that I'm supposed to serve? And how are they able to do the things we're asking them to do? Because growth, whether it's you know I can read Shakespeare and understand it completely and be able to dissect it and write some character analysis about, I don't know, Macbeth, it is less important than I can get through a difficult text and pull out some salient points about that text that I can then apply to the real world, or apply to my worldview, or apply to this relationship over here that helps me understand the dynamics in that relationship. That those are the important skills versus learning Macbeth.
Yeah. And I feel like it's this, we have this idea in education of like, we're going to develop curriculum and assessments for the standard student. And you're like, first of all, who are we talking about? Like, who is the standard student here? Let's talk about
Mm-hmm.
that. But then also like, I I don't know someone who has a standard brain. Like I've never met the person who I'm like, they wrote the research about you. Like you're the person that they were studying. Like it's this thing we love. I mean, I love research. Like as in education, we love research, but so often we fail to remember that like the point of research is essentially to make generalizations. It's to
Right.
look at a bunch of information and say, we looked at a lot of people and for the most part this is what we saw. But like I study a lot around about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the research, especially when it comes to grading, is like intrinsic good, extrinsic bad, just across
Right.
the board, almost blanket statement. And there have been a couple people who've brought it up to me, and I'm super grateful for it, of like especially anyone who has ADHD. um, that is a very different relationship with extrinsic motivation than like a neurotypical brain might consider extrinsic motivation. And so that was just, it's been a really good reminder to me of, as much as research is valuable in education, it is not a one size fits all. It is a kind of guideline recommendation, but we still have to recognize that that is not a human approach to using that information.
Right. And if we don't remember that, then we end up creating environments that are toxic, not only for the kids, but also for the adults in those environments trying to serve those kids.
And especially when it's paired with the message of this works, right? Like this should work, and all of a sudden you're like, I'm doing the thing and it's not working. Am I broken? Is the kid broken? Like what is going on? And you have to recognize like this is a guideline that might work, right? Like this is a direction to move, but there are two humans involved in that learning interaction, and neither human is perfect, and neither human has a normal like your standard research person brain. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, there's always a lot of variables and a lot of complexity built into the education system in and of itself that I don't think we always recognize or celebrate.
Mhm.
So before we wrap up, what are two kind of hacks for building that culture of learning and really leaning on motivation that teachers can utilize easily in their classrooms?
One of the most valuable pieces that I've been working on in my own practice is, actually someone way cooler than me coined it a hyper rubric, but I call them learning progressions. The idea
Okay.
behind it is, I early in my career I went through a bunch of unpacking meetings for standards, of like, let's unpack the standards, and we made a really cool document that gets put away in Google Drive and we never look at again.
For the
And so that
English
was
teachers who wordsmith it endlessly.
yes.
Like, what does it really mean to analyze? Like, what are we really saying when we say that? Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you have like an hour and a half discussion, and then everyone's like, we didn't really agree, but let's just move on and never talk about it again. So what I learned is like that unpacking process usually stops too short. We focus on it from the teacher side of things, which has value, like can be valuable. But what I've seen way more value in is when we unpack a standard and break it into the small steps that will lead to success. Because the way that it works when you start approaching assessment with kids that way, where it's really concrete steps. So like, uh for example, if I'm having a student write like a compound sentence,
Mhm,
step one might go all the way back to, can you identify a subject and verb? Like, do we even know the pieces that we're playing with as we're putting it together?
mhm.
Moving up to, more complex, independent clauses are, any things like that that'll scaffold their success towards knowing how to write a compound sentence. When we plan backwards and sort of break it out that way, you end up with, I just say there's access points for every kid. Because I think what happens a lot is you have a student who, for whatever reason, has a gap in their understanding where they never learned what an independent clause is. And we
Right.
have conversations in the classroom of just, let's skip to independent clause. You have to put two together, put a coordinating conjunction in the middle. And you're like the kid sitting there is like, I don't even know what you're talking about at all. Like
Right.
you missed me way before you even started talking. And so I've started building these learning progressions and using it with my kids to say, hey, here's the end goal, but these are like things that you can learn along the way. They're almost like checkpoints. Like, do you know what
Mhm.
this is? Do you know what this is? Because it engages students in what's called the competency confidence loop,
Mhm.
or the competence confidence loop of when a student feels like they got something, they develop the confidence to try something new.
Mhm.
Um, and so this little step of just when I say, here's something new we're going to focus on in the class, taking the time to really plan out this sequence and show it to kids. Here's, all the way from you have no idea what this thing is. You've never heard it before. This is the place you can start, and being able to show them tangibly you're growing, you're moving.
Mhm.
So that's probably been one that I've really noticed a difference in how kids use it in the classroom. Let's see, the other one, man, that's a tricky one. Trying to think. I guess for me, the other one that really is important is helping kids keep track of feedback.
Mm.
That's every English teacher's nightmare, is like, you have the pile of paragraphs, the pile of essays to grade, and you're giving feedback. And like that part, sometimes there's like a weird enjoyment involved in that process. Most of the time, by like essay 3 or 4, you're like, let's wrap it up. Let's find something new. And then the worst part is like, you're like, I gotta just like put my head down and get through all these, because tomorrow we're gonna do stuff with the feedback. And then you get to tomorrow and the kid's like, oh, cool. And then like gets rid of it and never sees it again. And you're like, I'm glad I spent my evening doing that. That was wasted time now. And
Right.
so what I've learned is really helpful is I now have, I called it their feedback portfolio. It's just a
Oh.
Google Doc. It's nothing fancy. It's a Google Doc with a table on it that has 4 columns. There's a column to link the assignment, a column for the assignment description, a column for, I call them glows and grows. So like glows are areas that they can celebrate, grows are areas that they need to work on, that are kind of next steps. And so every time a student gets feedback on something, like whether it's peer feedback, self-assessment, feedback from me, they take some time to take that feedback off whatever isolated document they got it on and put it into this feedback portfolio, so that the next time we start a piece of writing, it's, hey, open up your feedback portfolio. What's the thing you did well last time? Like, again, really trying to ground them in, you can do this.
Right.
And
And
then,
charting their own growth over
yeah,
time.
and
Yeah.
because that's something I realized, like, so often I would leave feedback of like, hey, you did it, you did a really good job here, like this is awesome, but they had no idea that 3 papers before, that was the thing that I said, this is something we need to work on. But when it's all on one page, now they have a chance to go back a couple rows and be like, hey, that thing I struggled with is now the thing that went in my glows column. That's awesome. And I like being able to see it too as I'm leaving feedback, because I feel like I can be a little bit more intentional with it, of
Right.
knowing this is the thing that they've worked on the last 2 assignments. Let's look for it. Is there something I can celebrate where I'm seeing growth around that? So those 2 things, adding in the learning progressions to help students see their steps along the way. And I'm now realizing they're basically 2 of the same thing, and the feedback portfolios where they get to see their success along the way. Like,
Well, they're two different things. They are they are, but there's also very different
yes,
elements of it.
yes. But I think it boils down to like, can students see that they are growing? Right? Like, I think that concept alone of however they're showing it, whatever they are
Right.
doing, can they see that they are getting better at this thing that they're working on? Because I know for me, like if I have to sit in a building for 8 hours a day and I never feel like I'm getting better at it, I will not enjoy being there. But if I can, at least if I have to go there and I can sit there and be like, oh, I'm getting better at something while I'm here, like that seems like a little bit more valuable use of my time.
Well, not only that, but what I heard you say earlier is that you're really providing a way for students to bring in their passions, their outside of school passions, which I mean, it is super important to that thing that they're supposed to learn.
Yeah, I get to do the thing, something that I maybe enjoy if I can, if it fits, I
Right.
would love to say every time I get to do that. It doesn't always happen, but like this is a space that I get to bring my whole self into, including my passions and interests and identity and culture. And I'm also getting better at learning. Like that's the ideal scenario, I think. And if we can aim for that as what we get to do with kids, that's a pretty sweet setup.
I agree. I think that's probably why I'm still in education. So, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up? I know we had this whole conversation guide and we didn't necessarily adhere to it, but I think the conversation we had was much richer than anything I had initially planned. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, the only thing that I always try to add right now, I mean, every year, but especially these last couple of years, if you're someone who works with kids in education, like I know it has not been easy the last few years. So truly from the bottom of my heart, thank you for sticking it out with kids and doing your best for them every day because it means so much. Man, I kind of joke sometimes when I do workshops, like it's not a workshop if I don't tear up. And I made it all the way to the end of this. And then saying that out loud, I know how much sometimes we need to hear it. So I hope those of you listening, if you needed that message, you got to hear it today.
awesome. Tyler, I could talk to you forever. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Awesome.
Uh,
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg. Please feel free to like, share, and comment on this episode. And thank you very much for listening.